Hey, welcome back to the 1-Year Bible Journey. I'm Pastor Cary. This is Growing in the Gospel YouTube channel, and we're working our way through the entire Bible in 52 weeks. So this is week 24, and I am so glad you are still on the journey. We have some tremendous reading this week. We are in 1 Chronicles 16 to 29 in the Old Testament, finishing the book of 1 Chronicles, which we talked about in yesterday's Old Testament video. And then you're in Acts 22 to 25 in the New Testament, which we'll talk about in a second, and then Psalms 71 to 73. So we left off last week at Acts chapter 21. We have now followed Paul, the Apostle Paul, all the way on all three of his missionary journeys. We've seen the gospel spread all across Asia, which is modern-day Turkey, and into Europe, modern-day Greece, northern Greece, southern Greece. From there, it's going to go. It's going to expand. Last week, Paul returned to Jerusalem. This is the end of his third missionary journey. He lands at the coast at the city port of Caesarea. He is met there by Philip the evangelist. He stays there many days. It's predicted that he's going to go to Jerusalem and be arrested. The believers in Caesarea say, "Don't go." He says, "I have to." He goes to Jerusalem. He is arrested in the temple grounds. A great tumult, a riot ensues. He's nearly killed. They drag him out of the temple grounds, and he is being assaulted, and the Roman soldiers save him. And they take him up into the garrison, the fortress, Antonia Fortress, which was attached to the temple grounds. And they begin to beat him. And he expresses, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. And anyway, he asks for permission to talk to the people. And the soldiers let him. He goes out to the staircase. He looks down on the crowd, the riot that was there, the angry mob. He asks them to listen to him. And that's where the reading left off last week. So when you pick it up in chapter 22, Paul is standing now before these people that want to kill him, and he is going to preach. He's going to testify in the temple grounds, and he's going to tell them about Jesus. He first tells his story, how he is a devout Jew, law-keeping Pharisee, tells them the whole personal testimony, which is going to be enjoyable for you to read because you're going to read this multiple times. Paul, in these crowds, keeps going back to his personal story. Interesting because he didn't do that in Athens, but he's doing that in these contexts because it's a point of connection. He identifies with these Jewish traditions and this Jewish history and tradition. But when he's with a Gentile audience or a Roman audience, he identifies as a Roman citizen. So Paul is brilliant. He knows how to approach these different people. You're going to see him play this very wisely, as Jesus said, wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. So Paul, when he mentions that God sent him to the Gentiles, the crowd loses their minds. And they riot again, and they start to press in, and they start to want to grab Paul and kill him. And again, the narrow escape, the soldiers grab Paul, bring him in, and that's when they begin to beat him to try to get him to confess what is going on. And that's when he pleads, wait a minute, is it lawful for you to be beating a Roman citizen without cause? Well, now they panic because they realize they've just violated their own laws. This Paul's learned how to play this citizenship thing. In Roman justice, he had rights as a Roman citizen. He had a right to a trial. So when you move into chapter 23, the next day, Paul is brought before the Roman leaders and the Jewish council. They called for a meeting, and the Jewish council, and he is rebuked, and then he rebukes, and then he's beaten. He's hit in the face, and then he repents because he was rebuking the high priest, and he shouldn't have been. There's a lot of nuance here in terms of the Jewish culture. But then Paul, when he's given a minute to answer for himself, he realizes he's in a no-win situation with the Jewish leaders. They just want him dead. And he's tried to appeal to them. They're not going to listen to him. He knows the Judaizers. He knows how they operate. But he sees a wedge, and that is that the room is filled with Sadducees and Pharisees. And the dividing point of these leaders is that the Pharisees, let me try to get this right here extemporaneously. Pharisees believed, well, one of them believed in a resurrection, and one of them did not believe in a resurrection. And it wouldn't take me 3 seconds to figure out which, but I don't want to get it wrong. And so he is going to use that division. And he says, hey, I'm being brought on trial concerning the resurrection. Well, now these two groups turn towards each other, and he foments debate and division in the room that isn't related to him. And I want to say it's the Sadducees that believe in a resurrection, and they side with Paul. They begin to favor Paul, and the Pharisees don't, or vice versa. Anyway, he plays it brilliantly in terms of political scene because he turns the courtroom against itself. In the division, in the melee, the soldiers again remove Paul to safety, and it's that night that the Lord appears to Paul in a vision and says, be of good cheer. You've testified of me here. You're going to testify in Rome. I love it when God does this because he is settling Paul's PTSD. He is calming Paul's fears. Paul is courageous, but he's also, nobody likes to be stoned or beaten or imprisoned. And so is it going to happen again? It's happened numerous times, but Paul again is comforted like he was at Corinth, personally by God. You're going to Rome, be of good cheer. This happens, as I recall, 3 times to Paul, and all of them were vulnerable times, fearful times. One was in Corinth when opposition started to arise. This moment when the Jews want him dead and he's incarcerated in Jerusalem. And then we're going to read a third time on a shipwreck or in a storm on his way to Rome. Okay. So 3 times at pivotal moments, God basically pours his assurance and calm and restfulness into the heart of Paul. He will do this for you too. He's done this for me in different ways, through his word, through the voices of godly friends and counselors and advisors, sometimes just the assurance of his spirit through circumstances or a song or some other way. God knows how to calm the hearts of his servants and focus us and let us know what he's doing when we're following him. So at this point, there's a group of men in Jerusalem that go on a hunger strike. They say, we're not going to eat until Paul's dead. Paul's nephew learns of this plot and warns Paul. Paul sends him to the commander, who removes Paul from Jerusalem overnight under heavy guard. This is epic. Paul travels at night from Jerusalem to Caesarea under the guard of 470 Roman guards. It's awesome how God protects Paul. And a letter is sent to the governor named Felix that is ruling at Caesarea, and he puts Paul in prison in Herod's palace at Caesarea. That's a great location to this very day. You can go to Caesarea on the coasts of Israel. You can see the remnants, the remains of Herod's palace. You can see some of the dungeon that's been excavated even recently where Paul was kept. You can see the very room where Paul made his defense that we're going to read about. It's just it's the foundation of the room. It's not built up. But they've identified this as the hearing room where trials were conducted, attached closely to the palace, I should say, of Herod that was there at Caesarea. It's not far from a large theater that's been excavated and from a hippodrome, a place where they had the chariot races and the gladiator fights and the entertainment, and where believers were tortured for their faith and were martyred for their faith against wild animals. So it's a sobering place as well. But Paul is taken there for his own safety. He's put into prison in Herod's palace. Chapter 24, 5 days later, the high priests, the accusers, come to Caesarea and they present a case with their lawyer, their attorney, Tertullius. And he basically stands up and tells Felix, the governor, this man's a troublemaker. Felix then lets Paul speak. And this is a very Jewish and a Roman kind of situation, okay? Paul professes his innocence, and explains to the Roman governor Felix, this is all about these guys disagreeing with me about my religious convictions. I am devoted to God like they are. I keep God's laws like they do. I have a clear conscience. And my real accusers, the guys that started this in the temple grounds days ago, are not even here. And they just began to scream and cry out against me because they don't like me. Well, Felix hears him and then later says, I want to hear you again. And he's married to a Jewish woman named Drusilla. So some days go by and Felix and Drusilla sit down and they hear Paul out. How cool is this? So for a long time, Paul gets to reason with them and teach them the gospel. He leads them through the discovery of Jesus. And they're fearful and they're under conviction, but they talked a long time. And they're so intrigued, they go often and talk to him. But we find out in this passage that Felix's motives were not so much that he was interested in becoming a believer, as much as he was hoping that Paul would bribe him. He was hoping that Paul would pay him off. Paul never got the clue or was not, let me say it this way. Paul wasn't about to bribe him because he had a captive audience. He was going to preach Jesus and give him the gospel. So 2 years go by, and Felix is then succeeded by another governor named Porcius Festus. When they transition, he leaves Paul in prison because he's hoping for bribes from the Jews. So then you turn to chapter 25, and Festus has inherited this situation that's been on a standstill for 2 years. Festus sits down with Paul, with leaders, and hears the accusations against Paul. And the leaders want him brought to Jerusalem, not so they can try him. Secretly, they're going to kill him. But the leaders come again to Caesarea, and they have a trial before Festus. Festus refuses to send Paul back to Jerusalem. And it's at this point that Paul appeals to Caesar. Well, it's the process. So as soon as a Roman citizen appeals to Caesar, Festus's hands are now tied. The case is going to be transferred to Rome. So again, Paul plays this legally and politically very wisely, very brilliantly. So a short time later, King Agrippa comes to town, representative of Caesar. Festus sits down with him, the governor, and says, I want to talk to you about a case I've been dealing with. And he counsels with Agrippa, and Agrippa says, it's essentially, you get this sense that Agrippa's heard of this man and is interested in this story and maybe heard of the story of Jesus. And so Agrippa and Bernice sit down and they want to hear Paul. And chapter 25 ends at this awkward place where Paul's about to testify. And so chapter 26 is next week's reading, but I'm just going to tell you right now, you're probably going to want to continue reading this week and read Paul's account before Agrippa and how he shares his story. And so we're going to talk about that next week, but it would make for great reading this week. What is going on here? Well, providentially, God has protected Paul's life. He's told him, you're going to testify in Rome. And now God is giving Paul amazing opportunities to testify of the gospel before governors and kings and political leaders at the highest levels. And on some level, this is a direct fulfillment of the prophecy, the prediction that Jesus made when he said, you're going to be brought before kings and councils in my name. You're going to represent me and you're going to possess your soul. And I'm going to be with you and I'm going to give you a mouth. I'm going to give you words to speak. So Paul is relying on the Holy Spirit to testify. When I taught through this section of the book of Acts, I think I called the series Tell Your Story, because Paul continually goes back to his personal testimony to testify of Jesus before whoever God gives him an audience with. So I want to wrap up today, and today will obviously be shorter, with just a challenge to you and to me that however God opens the door for you to tell your story, share your testimony. One of the most powerful and inarguable evidences of the validity of the gospel and the power of Jesus to transform a life is you. Your story is remarkable. It's as remarkable as Paul's. You say, well, it's not as sensational. That's not the point. Your story, you are God's person with a story that God is writing, and he sent you into your timeline, into your moment, to testify to your people. And he's going to give you an audience with whoever he gives it to. And by the way, he might be using suffering. He might be using your diagnosis. He might be using your pain to bring you in proximity to people that you otherwise would not have crossed paths with. And so as he used Paul's imprisonment and Paul's suffering, and Paul used that suffering to turn it into a platform for the gospel, I want to challenge you to, number one, leverage your hardship, leverage your suffering for the sake of the gospel. And number two, tell your story. Your story blended with the gospel, the truth of Jesus, is powerful. So don't underestimate it. Share your story. And you don't have to argue with people. It's not even up to you to convince them. It's not up to you to force a decision. That's not on you. The pressure's off, the burden's off. You don't have to win a fight. We're not trying to win fights. We're trying to win hearts. And almost everybody likes to hear a good story. And so probably the most unoffensive way to share the gospel with anybody that comes across your path is to simply ask permission. Hey, can I share with you a story of my life that has been profoundly influential and powerful and transformational? Would you have 5 or 10 minutes that I could share my story with you? And just tell them the story and tell them why you chose to believe in Jesus, and say, I just wanted to share that with you because if you ever wanted to choose to believe in Jesus, you could too. And I don't want to debate you or argue or force you to make a decision. I just wanted you to know or hear my story. My friend, you ask permission to share a story, you'll be surprised how many people will say, sure, I'd love to hear your story. Oh, and by the way, one way to open that door would be to say, I'd like to hear your story first. What is your story? Before I tell you my story, tell me your story. Because more than even people like to hear a story, they love to tell their story. And sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's regretful, sometimes it's emotional. But if you could get somebody to open up and tell you their story, what a wide open door you would have to tell your story. This is what Paul did. He used his suffering, he used false accusations, he used corruption and oppression to turn every moment, every trial, every death threat into a message leading and pointing to Jesus. And I hope to do the same in my life, and I hope you'll do the same in your life. So this is the end of week 24 for the 1-year Bible journey. I hope you enjoy the reading. I love your comments. So tell me what God is teaching you, and then invite someone else to the channel and share the journey with others. I look forward to reading your comments. I'm praying for you all. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.